17 young people were murdered at Marjorie Douglas Stoneman High School. That's gut-wrenchingly horrible. I cannot comprehend the twisted, depraved mentality that must be required to create that much grief. Some people, many of them of good conscience, say we ought to remove firearms from our society or severely restrict them to prevent such tragedies. I disagree. In a moment, I'll list 3 important things that I think we would greatly miss if firearms were mostly gone from our society. But the first question to ask is, if we did that, what would we get in exchange? The illusion is that if 2/3 of homicides are committed with guns, then getting rid of guns would get rid of 2/3 of homicides. Hey, that would be a great thing. I might even sign up for that. But it doesn't work that way. Firearms are not the root cause of violence. Those would be rage, hate, greed, lust, and lack of respect for other people. Hey, we had homicides long before we had firearms. Malaysia has the strictest gun laws you can imagine. Possession of a firearm in just 1 round of ammunition carries an automatic death penalty. Yet their homicide rate is a little worse than my home state, which is practically awash in legal and properly used firearms. If firearms are not available, rage, hate, greed, lust, and lack of respect for other people find alternatives. You can study all the international and state statistics in vain, looking for evidence in a reduction in total, not just firearm homicides, brought about by stricter gun laws. You can look, but unless there's been deceptive sleight of hand with the analysis, you're not likely to find anything. The United States Centers for Disease Control reviewed 51 scholarly papers on the subject and, quote, found insufficient evidence to determine the effectiveness of any of the firearms laws reviewed for preventing violence, end quote. There's plenty of variation in laws from state to state and country to country. If stricter laws would help, you'd think there would be more evidence of it. In fact, there's a major lack of evidence that eliminating firearms from our society would, on balance, provide any benefit at all. If we eliminated firearms, here's what I think we would be giving up as part of the bargain. Number 1, the ability of the weak and small to defend themselves. Professor and criminologist Gary Kleck did a study of how often Americans draw a firearm to prevent a crime, and he came up with an estimate of 2.2 million times per year. A recently uncovered study from the Centers for Disease Control came to the same conclusion, putting the number at 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year. That makes defensive gun uses about 140 times more common than homicides. My wife was one of those 2.2 to 2.5 million people. Late at night, in a hospital parking lot, a car full of rough-looking characters with shaved heads and sunglasses tried to cut my sweet grandmotherly wife off from reaching her car. They failed, but then pulled up behind her car and pinned it in with her in it. She took out her pistol and her cell phone and considered what to do. Since she was in a large SUV and the police were probably 30 minutes away, she simply made it clear to the bad boys that she was willing to put a trailer hitch through the side of their car. She backed them down and then left the scene. The bad guys want an easy target, not a fair fight. If you are attacked and draw a firearm, 93% of the time your assailant will flee. Number 2, we'd have a lot less wildlife and fewer recreation alternatives. Pop quiz. Was there more wildlife in the U.S. in 1900 or in 2000? The answer might surprise you. By a huge margin, the answer is 2000. And how did that happen? It was wildlife management, mostly financed by the sale of hunting licenses. Paradoxically, there are more deer, elk, bears, mountain lions, ducks, pheasants, and wild turkeys alive today because people hunt. Hunting and target shooting are normal, mainstream recreations for millions of ordinary people. In the time and town that I grew up, if you saw a group of teenagers walking toward the gravel pit at the edge of town with rifles over their shoulder, the common reaction was, there go a bunch of fine young people on their way to practice a useful skill. Yes, really. Number 3, our country would be less secure. Private firearms are a protection against domestic tyranny and foreign invasion. Now, some of you just rolled your eyes. When did private firearms ever prevent an invasion? One instance was December 7, 1941. At the outset of World War II, much of Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast were poorly defended. Japan could have seized U.S. territory without quick, massive opposition. There are many good reasons they didn't, and as we learned after the war, one of them was that they didn't know what their casualty rate would be with an armed populace opposing them. And as to domestic tyranny, you need look no farther than Athens, Tennessee. A group of crooked politicians tried to steal a ballot box in an election, and armed citizens rescued the ballots. Look up the Battle of Athens for the great story. The Second Amendment is a last-ditch barrier designed and put in place against domestic tyranny. The populace does not need to have the power to defeat the U.S. military, which would probably uphold the Constitution anyway. It just needs enough power to make tyranny an unattractive option. Those are the 3 things that I think we would miss greatly if firearms were eliminated. It would be a bad bargain. Imaginary benefits with real losses. When you list all the countries that report homicide rates from best to worst, the U.S. is close to the middle, 126th out of 219. Neither very good nor very bad. It's slightly better than the global average homicide rate. In spite of what you may have heard, the U.S. is not a particularly dangerous country, but it's not a shining example either, and I don't think we should be satisfied with that. There are things that we could and should do, but they are difficult. The evidence is that stricter gun laws are a solution that is simple, direct, soul-satisfying to some, and completely unproductive. Thank you for watching. All of you be safe out there.